7 different men looked at Audie Murphy and said no. 7 recruiters, 7 desks, 7 stamps on 7 forms. Too short, too light, too young. Come back when you've grown. The Marines didn't want him. The Navy didn't want him. The paratroopers almost laughed him out of the office. Every single one of them was wrong. Not a little wrong. Not wrong in a way that's easy to explain with hindsight. Ding. Wrong in a way that should make you question every assumption you've ever made about what a dangerous man looks like. Because the boy they kept turning away, that skinny, undersized farm kid from Hunt County, Texas, would go on to kill more enemy soldiers than any American combatant in the history of World War II. He would stand alone on a burning vehicle in a French snowfield and hold off 250 German soldiers until the army ran out of words adequate to describe what he'd done. He would come home wearing more decorations than most generals ever see in a lifetime. And every recruiter who stamped no on his application would spend the rest of their lives having no idea what they'd turned away. You can't understand what Audie Murphy became without knowing what built him. He was born poor in a way that has no modern equivalent. No floor in parts of the house, no guarantee of dinner. A sharecropper's existence on borrowed land in a Texas drought where the soil gave nothing easily, and neither did life. His father left when Audie was young, walked away from 11 children and a sick wife, and never looked back. His mother Josie held the family together through pure refusal to collapse. She worked, she prayed, she coughed harder every winter. Audie learned to shoot out of necessity, not sport. A rabbit meant dinner. A missed shot meant his brothers went to bed hungry. He became the most precise shot in Hunt County before he was 12 years old. Not because anyone taught him, but because missing had consequences he couldn't afford. In 1941, Audie Murphy was 16 years old. His mother was dying, and the world outside Hunt County was catching fire. Pearl Harbor happened. He heard it on a neighbor's radio and said nothing dramatic, made no speech, pounded no table. He just decided. The way men from that kind of poverty decide things, quietly and completely, without room for doubt. He tried the Marines first. They measured his height and sent him home. The Navy looked at his weight and did the same. The paratroopers saw that thin frame and told him to come back when he'd filled out. His sister forged his birth certificate to make him 17. Still no. 7 rejections across multiple branches of the United States military, each one a door closing in the face of a boy who had spent his entire life watching doors close. Finally, the Army accepted him. Barely. A recruiting sergeant who almost turned him away, a second look, a signature. June 1942. Private Audie Murphy, United States Army Infantry. Basic training nearly broke him physically. He fainted on the drill field twice in the first week. His commanding officer called him in and offered him a cook's position, warm, safe, behind the lines. Murphy looked at that officer and said 7 words. "Sir, I came here to fight, sir." The officer held his gaze for a long moment, then dismissed him back to training. He shipped to North Africa, then Sicily, then the grinding misery of the Italian campaign. And somewhere in that progression, officers began noticing a pattern. When a position stalled, Murphy was usually somewhere near the problem. When machine guns pinned men down, Murphy found a way around them. When wounded men were stranded in exposed ground, Murphy was often the first soldier moving toward them. When a situation called for someone to do something that nobody wanted to volunteer for, the men around him started looking in one direction without thinking about it. Nobody ordered this. Nobody assigned him the role. It just kept happening. His platoon sergeant said the men who served with Murphy didn't feel invincible around him. They felt like he would personally refuse to let them die. He carried his losses with him. Every man he watched die left something permanent inside him. Private Laddie Tipton, who died in Italy while Murphy held his hand in the mud. Sergeant Sylvester Anolik, who charged into machine gun fire until his body simply gave out. He carried their names, and he got colder and more precise. Not out of bloodlust, but out of something that looked, from the outside, like fury converted entirely into focus. By the time Murphy reached France, the Germans were already warning each other about him. In actual enemy intelligence reports, American soldiers called him the Little Major of the Texans. He wasn't a major. He was barely old enough to vote. But the Germans had noticed the same thing his own officers had, that certain positions held longer than they should, that certain advances stalled against resistance that shouldn't have been there, and that the same name kept appearing in the reports when they tried to understand why. Colmar Pocket, France, January 26, 1945. Temperature below freezing, the ground locked under a hard crust of snow. The forest pressing in from three sides with that particular winter silence that makes every sound carry farther than it should. Company B, 19 men after weeks of attrition, held a thin line near the village of Holzwehr. At 2 in the afternoon, the tree line erupted. 2 full companies of German infantry came out of the forest in a disciplined assault formation, 250 soldiers moving across the snow with 6 tanks rolling support behind them, their engines a deep grinding vibration the Americans could feel through the frozen ground before they could see what was making it. The German formation spread wide as it advanced, infantry fanning out to prevent flanking, tanks positioned to suppress the American line while the foot soldiers closed the distance. Against 19 men, it wasn't a battle, it was arithmetic. The order came immediately: fall back, call in artillery, survive. It was the right order, the only rational order. And the men began pulling back through the snow, using the tree line to the rear for cover, moving fast and low. In the support position behind the line, soldiers watching the German advance through field glasses counted the enemy infantry and reached for their own weapons with the particular sick feeling of men who understand that the numbers are very wrong. Murphy grabbed the radio and stayed. His voice on the handset was flat and controlled, feeding coordinates to the artillery battery positioned behind the American lines, while the German infantry closed to within 200 yards and kept coming. The artillery officer, on the other end, worked through the calculations and began walking rounds toward the German formation, the shells arriving with that distinctive freight train shriek, and throwing up columns of frozen earth and snow. It slowed the German advance. It didn't stop it. The infantry was dispersed and moving fast, the tanks pushing forward to absorb whatever the artillery sent, and Murphy needed time that the guns alone weren't going to buy him. He looked to his left. 30 yards away sat an M10 tank destroyer, American, already hit by German fire, burning steadily from the engine compartment. The crew was gone. The vehicle was finished as a fighting machine, its ammunition cooking off in irregular cracks and pops as the fire worked deeper into the hull, the whole chassis groaning under the heat. Anyone looking at that vehicle was looking at something that was going to explode. The only question was when. The .50 caliber machine gun mounted on top was still intact. Murphy ran for it, climbed the burning hull, and got behind the gun. The German infantry was 150 yards out when he opened fire. In the American rear, soldiers who had been falling back stopped moving. Officers pressed binoculars to their faces and tried to understand what they were seeing. A single figure on top of a burning vehicle, smoke pouring up around him in a thick black column, visible for miles. The M10 shuddering beneath him as internal ammunition cooked off, and the machine gun swinging in short, controlled bursts across the advancing German line. One man, one gun, and the German assault, which had been rolling forward with the momentum of an inevitable thing, began to stutter. One officer watching from the rear would later say he couldn't find language for it. He'd been in combat since North Africa. He'd seen men do brave things. He'd never seen anything like this. Murphy worked the gun with the same cold precision he'd brought to every firefight since Sicily. Not spraying, not panicking, picking targets and moving to the next before the first one finished falling. The first German charge broke, and the survivors went to ground in the snow and began working left, looking for the edge of his field of fire. He tracked them and kept shooting. They tried the right side. He swung back. The radio was still live beside him. The artillery officer was asking for updated coordinates as the German formation shifted and compressed under fire. Murphy gave them between bursts, his voice unchanged. Flat, precise, adjusting the artillery walk while managing the machine gun, doing two jobs at once on a vehicle that was burning with increasing urgency beneath him. He could feel the heat rising through the metal, feel the structural shuddering of the hull as the fire worked toward the fuel tank. The German commanders pushed harder. They sent a flanking element into the tree line to the left, a squad moving through the brush, trying to get an angle on the machine gun position from the side where the vehicle's burning superstructure would limit Murphy's visibility. He heard them moving in the frozen undergrowth before he saw them. The .50 caliber swung left and caught them coming out of the trees. The flanking attempt collapsed in the snow. The artillery officer came back on the radio. "How close are they?" Murphy answered without taking his eyes off the gun. "Right on top of me." More rounds came in. Somewhere during those 55 minutes, the Army's official tally of how long Murphy held that position, a German round, clipped his leg. He registered it and kept firing. The M10's internal ammunition was popping in rapid sequence now, the fire having worked deep into the fighting compartment. Soldiers watching from the American rear could see the vehicle was minutes from catastrophic structural failure. They watched and waited for the figure on top to come down. He didn't come down. When the fuel tank finally forced him off, not fear, physics, the simple unavoidable fact that the vehicle was about to come apart, he dropped into the snow with blood soaking through his trouser leg and immediately began organizing the survivors of Company B for a counterattack. On foot, wounded, moving forward into the same ground he'd just spent 55 minutes defending from above. He led it personally, pushing the German infantry back toward the tree line, closing distance on men who outnumbered his force by more than 10 to 1, moving forward with the same purposeful momentum he'd carried since the day he talked his way past the recruiting sergeant in Texas. The Germans fell back into the trees. 50 of them stayed in the snow. Murphy's commanding officer found him outside afterward, still on his feet, still directing his men's defensive positions, blood dark on his trousers in the cold air. The officer ordered him to the medical tent. Murphy looked at him. "Not yet, sir. The war ended." Audie Murphy came home at 20 years old, carrying 33 military decorations, every major American combat award, French decorations, Belgian decorations, the Medal of Honor for Holtzwihr. the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. They put him on the cover of Life magazine. A boy's face, a young man's eyes, and something old and unreachable living behind them. America wanted a hero it could feel good about. Murphy gave them the face. He kept everything else to himself, because here is what nobody wanted on a magazine cover. He came home and he couldn't sleep. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The moment his eyes closed, the mud came back, and the snow, and the burning tank, and the faces of men who hadn't made it. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for years. He told one interviewer, "I lie awake at night, and the pictures start coming and they won't stop." The Germans had failed to kill him. The tanks had failed. The machine guns had failed. 3 years of some of the most ferocious combat of the entire war had failed. Yet every night, when the lights went out and the house went quiet, the memories came back with perfect clarity. And memories are harder to fight than armies. There is no gun for that, no cover to take, no way to call in artillery on your own mind. Hollywood found him. His face was made for film. That lean jaw, those quiet eyes, that stillness. He made westerns. He was good at them. But sets made him anxious, crowds made him flinch, and loud noises stopped him without warning. He was 20 years old, living inside a head that hadn't stopped being at war, and the country that called him a hero had nothing to offer him for what the fighting had left behind. There was no name for it in 1945. No diagnosis, no treatment, no protocol. The Army used the phrase battle fatigue as though what he carried was tiredness. Something that would clear with rest and time. It didn't clear. He started talking about it publicly, when talking about it was genuinely dangerous. When veterans were expected to be grateful and functional and quietly fine, when the suggestion that war-damaged men was treated as ingratitude or weakness. Murphy talked about it anyway. He wrote about it, testified about it, pushed for recognition of what we now call PTSD, when the medical establishment barely acknowledged the condition existed. He didn't do it for himself. He did it because thousands of men were lying awake in the dark with the same pictures, and nobody was standing up for them. This is the part people don't know. The medal most people know. The magazine cover most people know. This part gets left out. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Murphy used every piece of credibility he had. Every decoration, every press appearance, every connection his Hollywood career gave him to push on a door that American veterans couldn't get through on their own. He testified before Congress. He argued with generals and politicians who had a vested interest in maintaining the mythology of the unbroken soldier, because the unbroken soldier doesn't ask for psychiatric funding and doesn't make uncomfortable speeches about what war costs the men who fight it. Not everyone wanted to hear it. Some officials listened politely, nodded respectfully, and went back to their offices and did nothing. Some believed veterans simply needed time, that the strongest thing a man could do was move forward and stop looking back. Others worried openly that discussing psychological wounds would damage the image of the American fighting man, that admitting the war had left marks would somehow diminish what those men had accomplished. Murphy heard all of it. He kept coming back. He walked into rooms full of people who wanted to shake his hand and use his face for their causes, and instead of giving them what they wanted, he told them what veterans needed: psychiatric care, treatment centers, recognition that the damage was real, and that the country that sent young men to war had an obligation to help them carry what came back with them. He used words that made military men in the 1950s genuinely uncomfortable: mental health, trauma. He said them in public repeatedly at a time when that language was treated as weakness dressed up as medicine. One senator told him privately that this advocacy was going to damage his reputation. Murphy looked at him the same way he'd looked at every man who'd tried to turn him away. "Good," he said. "Then people will know I said something worth saying." In 1949, he wrote his memoir, To Hell and Back. Not a celebration of heroism, but an honest, deliberately unromantic account of what infantry combat actually feels like. The smell and the mud and the boredom between the terror and the guilt of surviving when the men beside you didn't. Publishers wanted him to clean it up, make it more comfortable, more useful for the story America wanted to tell about itself. He refused because the men who needed that book didn't need mythology. They needed to read their own experience described by someone who had survived it. And wasn't going to dress it up. The book became a bestseller, then a film. Murphy starred in it himself, played his own life on screen, relived Holtzwehr in front of cameras. His director said the battle scenes were the easiest to film with Murphy on set. The quiet scenes, men waiting, grieving, enduring, were nearly impossible, because that's where the real war lived in him, not in the explosions, in the spaces between them. He was 45 years old when he boarded a small private plane in Georgia on May 28, 1971. Still working, still making calls on behalf of veterans, still pushing against the slow machinery of institutional indifference. The weather turned over Virginia. The plane went down into Brush Mountain. There were no survivors. He was buried at Arlington with full military honors. His grave became something people visit, not because they were directed to, but because they felt they owed him something they couldn't precisely name. Veterans, families of veterans, young men and women in uniform, still figuring out what service actually costs. A steady, quiet stream of Americans who find their way there on their own. His grave is the second most visited at Arlington. After Kennedy's, 7 men sat behind 7 desks and looked at Audie Murphy and saw the same thing. Too short, too light, too small. A skinny farm kid from a Texas dirt county, with no money, no connections, and no business asking to carry a rifle for his country. They stamped the forms and called the next man in line. They were looking at the boy. They couldn't see what the boy was made of. The war found out. 50 German soldiers dead in a French snowfield found out. Every veteran who slept a little easier because someone finally stood up in a government and told the truth, they found out too. 7 times America told Audie Murphy he wasn't enough. Then the world got a longer look, and nobody questioned him again.